as of 1816, South Carolina had all of this optimism that it's going to become the great industrial center of America. It's going to have the textile industry in South Carolina, where it makes a lot more sense to locate it than in New England, where you have to take the raw material all the way up there to serve the cotton mills of New England. It makes more sense to have them in South Carolina. And the reason why they're going to New England is because of they need the capital, they need the labor, they need the power, they have all of those in New England. But South Carolina says we have it here too. We have merchants from Charleston who have engaged in trade for years. They have stored up capital. They have money to invest in textile mills. We can use steam engines instead of relying on water power, as almost all textile mills did. As of the 1830s, late 1820s, 1830s, almost all American factories relied on water power, so that means they have to be in places where there's water power available. But South Carolina says, wait a minute, we've got steam engines, we'll use steam engines. And then the key, of course, was that we have cheap labor. That was one of the reasons why the industry was located in New England, was because of the large number of farm girls whose families were very poor and anxious to have their daughters go to work in a textile mill, at least for a couple of years, to help support the family. And that was the labor of the early days of the textile industry in New England. But South Carolina says, well, we've got slaves, we'll use slave labor. So they expected to become the industrial center of America. And that's why they were pro-tariff. They thought the tariff was going to protect our textile mills, which were going to be building and booming and having all this great industrial growth. And it didn't happen. As of 1828, when Congress raised tariffs again, there were 0 textile mills in South Carolina. Not one factory had been located there. South Carolina was not a booming economic area. As a matter of fact, at a time when most of the country is experiencing a lot of growth and expansion and prosperity, I've mentioned several times, this is the 1820s. This is a boom time for the United States. The country is doing very well economically. Factories are opening. People are moving out into the West, settling land. Farmers are expanding. Cities are growing. Trade is expanding along the canals and using steamboats, and the economy is just doing great in the 1820s, but it's doing poorly in South Carolina. South Carolina is not a success story. Charleston, which had been, even during the colonial days, it had been one of our major cities. It had been like the 4th city in the United States. The big 3 were, of course, Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. But always number 4 was Charleston. Well, Charleston's not growing. Charleston is not expanding. And by 1828, Charleston has been passed up by many cities in the United States. Some of them older coastal cities, such as Baltimore and Newport, Rhode Island. But even by interior cities like Rochester, New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, St. Louis, Louisville, Pittsburgh, they're all passing Charleston. Charleston has become a real low-ranking city. It's not growing. It's not prospering. And the state is doing poorly. The population of rural areas is actually declining. People are leaving South Carolina and moving out into the other areas of the Southeast. Why did this happen? What caused South Carolina to go wrong? Well, there are several reasons. One is, yes, there are people in Charleston who have assets, who have cash. They have cash reserves. They have money to invest. But they didn't invest them in textile mills. There were other things that they could invest in with more certainty with greater security, and probably with higher returns. And those two things are linked. Because what's happening is, as the cotton is taking over the South, Southerners are moving out into other areas off to the west. They're moving into western Georgia, modern-day Mississippi, Alabama, even out into Louisiana, and as we'll see, as far west as Texas. So those areas are booming, and people are leaving South Carolina to move out there. But South Carolina's capitalists are investing in that land because the potential returns are so great. If you've got money to invest, you can go out and buy some real estate in some place like Alabama, and people are flocking in. The demand for land is going up. You can sell your land at a substantial profit, and it's a way to make a lot of money, and that's what people are doing. And they're investing in land rather than in textile mills. And then related to that, there is a demand for slaves. People are needing slaves on those new cotton farms spreading out throughout the South there, throughout what sometimes I call the cotton belt, because it's an area where you can grow cotton. So cotton is booming, but the demand for slaves is really increasing. And at the same time, in the sort of the traditional areas of slavery in the United States, places like Virginia and Maryland, which had always been slave states and where slavery had been part of the local economy since colonial days, those are not cotton states. They're southern states, they're slave states, but they're too far north for growing cotton. So there's still tobacco farms there, there's still other types of agriculture that use slave labor, but it's just not the big expanding area like the cotton areas of the so-called cotton belt that stretches from western Georgia all the way across to Texas. So what's happening is that shrewd investors, capitalists, are looking at this and saying the price of slaves in, say, Virginia is not very high. There's still tobacco plantations there, but it's not growing, it's not expanding, there's no new demand there. So the price of slaves in, say, Virginia is relatively low, but out in the new booming South Cotton Belt area of, say, Alabama and Mississippi, the price of slaves is booming, it's going up. So shrewd capitalists are like buying slaves in Virginia, moving them out to, say, Alabama, and selling them at a great increase in price. South Carolina capitalists are investing in land and slaves, not investing in textile mills. And so a number are being built. And then underlying this is questions about the use of slave labor in an industrial setting. Slaves were used overwhelmingly in agriculture. In the United States, slaves had been used for almost every economic activity you can think of, but always predominantly in agriculture. And by the 1820s, 1830s, as cotton is just taking over the country, or at least part of it where you can grow cotton, more and more slaves are used exclusively for the production of cotton. So while slavery had been very diverse at a certain point, increasingly more and more of our slave population is identified with cotton. And on a cotton mill, or on a cotton farm, you could force slaves to labor. And people did. And slaves would labor because they had no choice, and because they faced physical punishment if they didn't. And a lot of slaves just decided, I don't want to be punished. And I try to think of myself, of what I would be like if I were a slave. And I know myself. I know I am not some great person. I don't want to be punished. If I have to do something in order to avoid punishment, in order to avoid physical abuse, in order to avoid pain, I'll do it. I mean, I'm not at all proud. I'm perfectly willing to admit, if a master tells me get out and work in that field, I'll get out and work in the field. But I also know myself well enough to know that I'm a real sneaky guy, and that if I could some way sort of meet the demand of my owner, my master, to work, but still do it on my own terms, I'd do it. And that was slaves. We're all human beings. And slaves were human beings, and slavery is not compatible with human nature. We're not meant to be slaves. We are meant to control our own lives. That's part of our genetic makeup. We want to have control over our own lives. And slaves were human. They wanted to do it. Now, they were in a horrible position because they'd get beaten, they'd get abused, they'd get mutilated. So yeah, they had to go along with that. But they'd find ways to assert their humanity. It actually became known among slave circles as putting on old massa. That was a phrase that sort of circulated among slave communities. And slaves kind of took advantage of it, and they kind of delighted in it. It became kind of a game that you could play with your master. You try to show, well, okay, I'm going to go out in this field, but I'm going to work as slowly as I can because I want to decide how fast I work. Now I have to thread a thin line here, because if I go too slow, the master's going to beat me. So I'm going to figure out just how slow I can go and still avoid a beating. And that's putting on old massa. Working as little as you can without getting punished. And as I say, it's a game. And slaves got real good at it. The stereotype, of course, was that slaves were lazy and slow and so forth, incompetent, lazy. And that was the standard view of slaves. Oh, they're all just lazy. They have to be beaten in order to get them to work. Well, people who said that, the owners and Southerners and so forth, they missed the point. They didn't know what was going on. They didn't realize that by working slowly, slaves were asserting their humanity. They were saying, yeah, you can beat me, and I don't want to get beaten. So I'll work here, and I'll work as fast as necessary, but I work as slow as I can possibly do so. Or they do things like, break a tool. They'd be given a hoe, go out and hoe that field, and they'd go out and break the hoe. And then they'd sit down and wait for the rest of the day. And the master sometime later would come out and say, hey, you broke the hoe. Yeah, it broke, master. They said, well, why didn't you come and get another one? You didn't tell me to come and get another one. Well, you're playing a goddamn game with those guys. And if you spend a day sitting around with a broken hoe, you've won for that day. And again, there's a stereotype that slaves are stupid. No, they're not stupid. They're just asserting, saying, I am a person. You can beat my body, but I still have my soul. I still have my spirit. I'm still a human being, and I'm going to show it by doing as much as I can get away with. I'm going to keep doing it. And of course, there were even some slaves who said, I don't care if I get beaten. I'm going to take the beating. And I have to say, and there's a lot of evidence of that. We know that slaves got beaten, and we have pictures of slaves with scars all over their body from beatings and so forth. And I have to say, myself, I have nothing but respect and admiration for people who were strong enough to do that, because I'm not one of those. You know, I don't want to get beaten. But there were exceptional slaves, slaves of greater courage than I have, who said, you can beat my body, but I'm still going to be a person. And even more drastically, slaves began running away, and slaves would leave. The South was just absolutely bedeviled by runaways. Slaves were leaving in vaster numbers, and this became a serious problem for Southerners. One of the biggest industries in the South was slave catchers. There were all kinds of people, white people, who went into business for themselves with a business to go and catch slaves and bring them back. And that was a standard part of the whole history of the South, the whole history of slavery. It's a part of Southern history that modern day advocates of the Confederacy tend to overlook. You know, they put up statues of Robert E. Lee and other Southern Confederate generals, but they don't put up statues of the slaves who were really the people making the South operate. And yeah, they would be beaten. One of the things that slaves, that owners would do, I mean, you can see this in slave records, they would put some sort of a mutilation on a slave. They'd cut off an ear or something like that, or do something to physically mark a slave. They puncture their hand or something like that. And you see ads for runaways. You'd say, you know, answers to the name of so and so is missing the right ear or something like that, and as a mark of identification to make it easier to catch them, because catching slaves was a necessity, because runaways were so high that it just became even more and more of a difficulty. The most extreme form of well, if you want to call it putting on en masse, but it also extended to the most ultimate form of resistance, were slave rebellions. Times when slaves actually took up arms, killed their masters, and ran away and revolted and declared their independence. This didn't happen all that often, because if it did, the white establishment would track down all of the slave leaders and execute them. One of the most famous slave uprisings took place in 1831 in Virginia, where a slave named Nat Turner, who was a house slave, he was one of the slaves that had been taken into the house to work with the family and serve meals and so forth. So he was one of the sort of the trusted, the elite. But he led a rebellion and executed his master's family, led other slaves into an execution, was eventually captured and killed. But this Nat Turner's rebellion terrified the South. They just think that, oh my God, this whole thing is just drastic, and they couldn't see that they were trying to hold on to a system that's just impossible. It's against human nature. But in that situation, nobody dared to put slaves into an industrial setting. It was one thing to have a slave break a hoe and say, oh, I don't know what happened, boss. But do you want to put them into a factory where there's substantial investment in machinery and so forth? Oh, the axe, or the wrench, fell into the gears, crashed the gears, caused thousands of dollars damage. Oh, sorry, it just slipped. No, you don't want to do that. So in that situation, South Carolinians did not invest in slavery, in textile mills, did not dare put slaves into an industrial setting. So South Carolina's attitude on the tariff changed.